Good evening and welcome to yet another episode of Who's Who in the Bible, praying with biblical characters. And today, we're going to look at a very fascinating prophet called Amos. He's considered one of the minor prophets, but let me tell you, he packs a major punch. So as we explore a little more about this prophet Amos, let us be conscious that we are doing this in an environment of prayer. Our gracious and loving Father, you create each one of us in your own image and likeness, giving us that dignity and the equality that comes from you. You remind us of our own preciousness, but you also remind us to be conscious of the preciousness and the sacredness of others. We allow ourselves, through your word in the prophet Amos, to be conscious of the sacredness, to be conscious that this dignity belongs to all, and that when it is attacked, we will be the voice of justice. We know that your Spirit is with us, and so we make this prayer with deep faith in Jesus, our Redeemer and our Lord. Amen. When I took the episode of Introduction to the Prophets, I spoke about the former prophets, also known as the pre-literary or the pre-classical prophets, and then I spoke about the latter prophets. We've looked at a few of these former prophets, like Elijah, Elisha, Samuel, or even the prophet Nathan when we looked at David. But now we move on to what are known as the latter prophets. And this group of prophets, the latter prophets, begin from the 8th century BC onwards. These latter prophets are also known as the classical prophets or the literary prophets. They are referred to as the literary prophets because they have got a book ascribed to their name. And so we have, as I've mentioned earlier in the earlier episode, we have three major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. But we also have 12 minor prophets. Now we call them minor not because they are not important, they are. We call them minor for two reasons. One is that they do not have that extensive body of literature as the three major prophets have. And secondly, while each of the major prophets have their individual and independent scrolls, the 12 minor prophets are all put together in one single scroll. Now, when we look at the minor prophets, actually the prophet Amos figures third in the list of the 12. However, we are beginning with Amos simply because in terms of time, in terms of chronology, Amos appears the first. In fact, he's the first of all the classical prophets, whether major or minor. He belongs to the 8th century when there were 4 important prophets. The first is Amos, and then he's followed by Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah. But today we will focus on the figure of Amos. And so it is important for us to know a little bit, first of all, as to who this man is, before we uncover his message and his word that is proclaimed with such conviction. He was born in a place called Tekoa, which is about 12 miles south of Jerusalem. That means he belonged to the kingdom of Judah. But he went to preach in the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, what was his profession? What was he really doing before he became, or rather was called to become a prophet? To have a sense of that, I'm going to read to you from chapter 7, verses 14 and 15. Let me give you the background. Let me give you the context. Remember that he is come from the southern kingdom to another nation, that is the northern kingdom. And there he is prophesying, speaking truth to power against the unjust practices that were happening both in the royal court as well as in the temple. And there he comes face to face with Amaziah, a priest who is ministering at the shrine in Bethel. And the words of Amos really trouble the priest serving at that shrine. And this is the conversation that I want to read now for you. It starts from chapter 7, verses 10 onwards. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. And listen now, verse 12. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. Listen to the response of Amos, because we get a clue as to what he was doing before he became or was called to be a prophet. Then Amos answered Amaziah, I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go, prophesy to my people Israel. That was a very strong exchange. What is the prophet Amos saying? The prophet Amos was saying, I had a comfortable life, a comfortable livelihood. I was a farmer. I was having cattle. I had no interest. I was not a prophet. Neither was I belonged to the line of prophets in my family. But I'm here simply because God has called me. It's not something I wanted. And that's why I was taken away from one kingdom and asked to prophesy in your kingdom. He did not come to earn his bread. And so we see that here is the prophet realizing that it is a calling from God, not his own self-desire. Because what we see through this exchange is he was merely obeying God. He was an ordinary man doing an ordinary job, but he had come with a particular message to a particular situation. And the challenge he faced was to speak truth to power, to the power of the government and to the power of the religious establishment. Because he was called to be a prophet in this land of the northern kingdom, Israel, where they were wealthy and arrogant people who were unjust and oppressive. Now, when did the prophet Amos minister? Actually, he ministered during the time of King Jeroboam II, of the king of the northern kingdom, Israel. He was there a king for a long time, almost 40 years. But Amos prophesied for merely just 1 year. They say probably in the year 760 BC. In fact, just a little before the time that the prophet Hosea came on the scene. Now we call Amos as the prophet of social justice. Let's get this terminology right. He was not just a social rebel. He was not just a rabble-rouser. He was speaking on the need for justice not only on the individual level, but on the social level, the level of society. And as a prophet, he was concerned about two important dimensions. One is concerning the covenant, and the other is concerning the liturgy. First, the covenant. The covenant that God entered into with his people was a kind of a constitution by which the kings had to live by. And so this constitution was to be lived out not only by the king, but also by the people. And it was the role of the prophet to remind the king and the people to live by the covenant, that constitution. The other dimension that he was very concerned about was the liturgy, because the liturgy was to be an expression of the relationship between God, but also the relationship between the neighbor. And so Amos is reminding the people, the kings, the priests, all of them, of the need to be faithful to the covenant. Amos also reminded them that the liturgy had to be celebrated the way it was meant to be. And thirdly, Amos was the voice of God, prophete, who spoke for God. We call him the prophet of social justice because when the covenant obligations were ignored, when the liturgy was merely an empty show, he comes on the scene to shake them up, to remind them to understand what is the mind and what is the heart of God. Now, if we are going to understand the words and the message of the prophet Amos, it's important for us to understand the political background and the socio-economic situation of that time. That's important because it is in that context we will listen to those words and we will then interpret those words for our time. Politically, what was the political situation like? Well, as you've been following these episodes, you realize that the United Kingdom that David ruled after the death of Solomon was split into two kingdoms. The southern kingdom was the kingdom of Judah, also known as Zion, and the capital was Jerusalem. But the northern kingdom was the kingdom of Israel, also known as Ephraim or Jacob, and the capital was Samaria. They were like two brothers, but now separated into two kingdoms. Now, the king in the southern kingdom of Judah was King Uzziah, who was a king for almost 40 years, a long period. Similarly, in the northern kingdom of Israel, where now Amos is now ministering, the king was King Jeroboam II, who lived as king for a long period of 40 years. So what does that say of the political situation? There was a political stability. There was a political calmness because there was long reigning kings. There was no conflict between the two brother kingdoms. And so that was a time of political stability. That's internal. But external, there were other nations who were superpowers at that time, particularly Egypt or Syria and Assyria. They were the imperial powers. But during this period, when the time that Amos was there, they were rather weak. And so they left both these kingdoms alone. Neither Israel nor Judah were troubled by these foreign dominating powers. And when you don't have wars to fight, when there is some kind of a political stability, there was a greater sense of a material prosperity. The standard of living went up. But while there was material prosperity, there was also a social corruption and a religious corruption. And so Amos comes to condemn this situation. Now, I said there was political stability, but it was not going to be for long. Soon a storm is going to erupt because Assyria is now going to get more and more powerful, and finally in 721 will come and just gobble up the northern kingdom. But that time has not yet come. And so the prophet Amos is challenging them. He says, the storm will come. And through his proclamation, he will tell them why. We look now a little bit at the socioeconomic situation in which Amos found himself. Now, according to the covenant that both the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel were bound by, it's interesting to see how the ownership of land was recognized. Land was not just a piece of property. It gave the owner of the land a sense of rootedness and belonging. In other words, to have that portion of land given to you, to your tribe, to your family, was something that you held on to, because that was a mark of your identity. When we looked, for example, at the prophet Elijah, when we saw how King Ahab was trying to take away the property of Naboth, he even gave him the choice of another land and a better price, but he said, no, this is my family inheritance. And so the land was meant to be part of one's belonging to the community of people. Now, what happens is the covenantal obligations were beginning to be ignored. Let me indicate some of these. Under the covenant, all the different groups of people, the tribes, were meant to come to the mutual help, the mutual aid of one another. For example, when it came to agriculture, they would plant together, they would reap together. When it came to the defense of one group of people, when they were attacked by outsiders, they went to their protection. When they needed assistance, they were there. But now, at the time of Amos, there was beginning to be a divide among the people, and some of them, the more affluent, the more powerful, were not willing to come to the mutual aid of the people. That's the first point I can make, and you'll see that in chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. The second point that I want to make is how the powerful began to grab the property of the weaker people. And they did it in a number of ways, legal as well as illegal. First, one of the ways they did it was the high interest on loans. In the time of drought, when people didn't have money, they would go to the wealthy ones who could loan them money, and they gave them loans for which the interest rates were exorbitant, very high. And when they could not pay back those loans, what they did was they grabbed the land. They threw the occupants outside. They sometimes reduced them to tenant farmers on what was once their land, and now they became almost slaves. As the land holdings of some of them increased, that's the third point I want to make, the wealth and the social power began to increase. They, because they were in a position of authority, raised higher taxes on the poor. And at the time of Amos, only 5% of the people enjoyed prosperity and peace. Only a few families benefited of this enormous material prosperity. There began to be a change also in the economic structure of that time. They began to change the use of the land. So some of the land that was for food crops like barley and wheat were now turned into cash crops like olive and vine. Because these brought you higher profit, greater money. And with these products which they exported, they got more wealth and they imported very fancy things like ivory furniture, jewels, perfumes. And with the wealth that they got, they imitated the lavish lifestyle of the people of imperial powers like Assyria and the rest. But the problem was there was less food because there were less cash crops, less grain, and more famine. I've given you an idea of what was the socioeconomic situation. It was a situation in an environment of suffering. And it is in this context, the political background and the socioeconomic situation, that the word of the Lord picked up Amos from the southern kingdom of Judah and brought him to the northern kingdom of Israel to proclaim this very powerful message as he called the people back to their covenant obligations. What I'd like to do now with you is to quickly go through some of the elements that you will find in the book of Amos. I would like to just give you an outline of the book. It can be divided into 6 parts. We have the prologue, the introductory word, which Amos announces when did his ministry begin. The second part is we have 8 oracles, sayings against the nations. 6 from the neighboring nations, 7th to the southern kingdom, and the biggest one, last of them, left for the nation Israel. After these 8 oracles, the third section is 3 calls to hear the word of the Lord. They're addressed to 3 groups of people. First is to the Israelites in general. Second is to the women, the wealthy aristocratic women from Bashan, that is in Samaria. And the third is to the house of Israel. The fourth section in the book of Amos are 3 warnings or 3 woes. One, and the first one is to those who pervert justice. The second is those who seek the day of the Lord. I will soon come to that. And the third is woe to those who live a life of ease and comfort in Samaria. The fifth section concerns 5 visions of judgment. And the last section is the epilogue. As we look at this book and as we go further, I want to now just bring before you you would say a song, a folk song that was made popular by Pete Seeger. Now, Pete Seeger is, I would think, a man who really had his pulse on the social issues of his time. I would say he translates into modern popular music what can and what should be done in the cause of bringing a better world because of a voice on social justice. And so I just like to take and present the words of the song. It's called God's Counting on Me, God's Counting on You. I'm sure you can just check it out on YouTube. But listen to the words of this song. When we look and when we see, things are not what they should be. God's counting on me, God's counting on you. Hoping we'll all go through, hoping we'll all go through, hoping we'll all go through, me and you. That's the chorus. But listen to the rest of the verses, because they are a call, just as a call to each one of us to respond prophetically. Time to turn things around, trickle up, not trickle down. God's counting on me, God's counting on you. Yes, when drill, baby, drill turns to spill, baby, spill, God's counting on me, God's counting on you. When there's big problems to be solved, let's get everyone involved. God's counting on me, God's counting on you. Don't give up, don't give in. Working together, we all can win. God's counting on me, God's counting on you. When we work with younger folks, we can never give up hope. God's counting on me, God's counting on you. What we do now, you and me, will affect eternity. God's counting on me, God's counting on you. Hoping we'll all go through, hoping we'll all go through, hoping we'll all go through, me and you. My friends, we've not finished with Amos yet. We have another episode awaiting us, because there we look a little more closely at his message and its implications for our time. In the meantime, with the little background information I've given you, I invite you to read the book of the Prophet Amos, because you have the political background, you have the socioeconomic background, and you have a man who has the covenant and the liturgy at his heart, speaking truth to power, whether it was the power of the state or of religion. May his words resonate within us before we begin the next episode, continuing with the book of Amos. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you for joining us, and we await you for the next episode as we continue with the book of Amos. Good night, and God bless you.